was an earth-shattering wake-up call for all of Mississippi and all of the Deep South and the entire United States. 70 years ago, there was a great black man who stood for this nation, who stood for what it meant to be. He fought for the rights of millions, billions of people. And he was the one who strived to make every single person equal. It is truly a shame to see that 60 years after the coming of Martin Luther King and 160 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, that we are still underscoring blacks, Jews, Hispanics, Asians, all in the favor of one race. There is still racism embedded nearly every corner you go. And it stopped shrinking. Now it's just getting more subtle. We must protest for our rights. Just because somebody has a different color in their skin, a different pigment in their skin, just because somebody looks different than us, we are treating people from a different continent like a different kind. And it's not just blacks. It's not just that. It's hundreds of minorities around the world. As Martin Luther King Jr. himself described, we are stranding hundreds of thousands of people on islands of poverty. We cannot stand for this any longer. 250 years have passed since President Jefferson wrote in the Constitution, all men are created equal. And so, when will that time come when all men are truly equal? We need to strive for that time. If we want that change, we have to be that change. We have to change. And so, that is why we must rescue these hundreds of thousands of people from all of the hardship that they have went through, simply because of their ethnicity, where their families came from. We all have the same heart, and we all have the same potential. Our purpose is to not quarrel over each other and limit each other's potential. Our purpose is rather to use that potential to the best of our ability, so that we can make the world a better place for everyone and make sure that those others who are left out can use their potential to the best of their ability.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Today is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Martin Luther King Jr., also commonly known as MLK, was one of the biggest civil rights activists for blacks in history. He had a father who would always stand up for him. He had a black father who was an early activist, and he stood up for Negro rights in the South, where decades after the Civil War had settled with the Union victory and slavery was abolished, black people were still being underscored by whites. Black people were still being trampled over by whites. He stood up for black equality, and that is why we revere him. And so, he had a lot of opposition, as everywhere he went, he would preach about black and white equality. Thus, all of the hate groups, including the infamous Ku Klux Klan and the hundreds of white supremacists scattered around the South, bitter about losing the Civil War, they stagnated his progress, And all of this opposition eventually culminated in his assassination on April 4th, 1968. Now, he was born in 1929. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., who was previously known as Michael King Sr., was an assistant pastor in 1926 to a church. When the senior pastor died, he decided to take up the role for himself. King Sr. Then went to a meeting for the BWA, standing for the Baptist World Association in Berlin. There, he witnessed the Nazis rise to power. And due to this, the BWA, after that conference, raised a revolution condemning the Nazis' oppression of minorities, such as the Jews, and really anyone who is not an Aryan, perceived by Hitler himself, the Führer. Returned back to the Deep South. And in 1926, he married. In 1929, him and his wife, Alberta, had a child together, Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, after his return from the BWA, in 1934, he decided to rename himself Martin Luther King Sr. and his child, Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. would see his father as his role model throughout his life. When he was young, his father would always stand up for himself, and he saw this as inspiration. One day, when he was in a shoe shop, the white shop owner forced his father to go sit in the back since he was colored. But his father said, "I am not going to sit in the back." His father resisted the will of the shop owner. And another day, a police officer stopped Martin Luther King Sr. on the road, called him boy. He pointed to his son, Martin Luther King Jr., said, "That is a boy. I am not a boy. I am a man." He always stood up for his own rights in front of his child, something that millions of blacks were afraid to do for fear of persecution from the whites, from the racist law system. As a child, he would go to the all-black high school and then an all-black college, the only one in his entire town. And it was only created because his grandfather had been begging to the mayor to create one. Because all of the other schools in town, they were all white. This segregation was absolutely unmatched by anything. And so, Martin Luther King Jr. felt the need to stand up for himself. He later described King Sr. as a true father to him. In 1955, he orchestrated the Montgomery bus boycott. This was a boycott of buses due to the fact that buses were segregated. All black people were forced to either stand in the back, or they were forced to sit on the rooftop of the bus. And so, this segregation, it disheartened Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I can't find a way to describe it. And so, in 1955, he organized a boycott. All of the black people in the entirety of Montgomery, Alabama, they were to boycott all the buses in the area. And after nearly 2 years, they finally won with a Supreme Court case ruling that all buses, only buses, solely in the city of of Montgomery, Alabama shall no longer be segregated. Segregation in those buses, Montgomery buses, extremely exclusive, was prohibited. It was a small victory for sure, but there was still much more to go for the Black and Negro community. In the 1960s, there were many civil rights riots and protests. And so, Martin Luther King Jr. often led these protests and made large speeches. In fact, he had been arrested multiple times at this point. This was because many people got angry with him breaking the law, which was favored by things like the Jim Crow laws in the South. Remember, the South was deeply segregated. Even decades later, the roots of the 1860s, the slave labor, was still part of the Deep South. And so, however, Martin Luther King Jr. stood up for himself. In 1963, there was a huge protest. There was also a brutal, horrifying massacre by policemen in which they let out police dogs and sprayed people with high-pressure water hoses. And this was the tipping point. He had been arrested in 1963 for all of the things he had been doing, all of the protests, all of the civil rights action. For the bettering of lives, he was thrown in jail. And what's even worse, in 1963, that was his 13th time in jail. He would go on to be jailed 16 more times in the remaining 5 years of his life. The same year, there was much tension over Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, his house was even bombed and he was thrown in jail once again because of his alleged crimes. And so, this overnight garnered the attraction of all of the media. And eventually, there started to become more and more protests. He was let free on bail from the president of a labor union which still exists today. And so, after that, he, the same year, would go on to make one of the greatest speeches in all of mankind. This could not be rivaled by anything else in U.S. history. It was, "I have a dream." Let me just recite one line from the speech so you can see how powerful it is. To stop this insane segregation and to accept each other as equals. In fact, after this speech, it was so revolutionary that the FBI started to notice what MLK had been doing. In fact, they even sent an anonymous letter, in 1964, in order to try and blackmail him. This was there was so much pressure and opposition cracking down on the civil rights movement. Not only Martin Luther King, but so many more people, including people like Rosa Parks. And so, all of this strife, all of this, and sadly, in 1968, in a motel in Memphis, Tennessee, he was shot to death by a white supremacist, Jack Earl Ray. Earl Ray was later sentenced to 99 years in prison. That became 100 when he escaped to Mexico. And finally, Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy will last forever. He and his messages are timeless. They cannot be stopped. They cannot be stopped by race. They cannot be stopped by war. They cannot be stopped by the years. They cannot be stopped by time. If his messages are forgotten, someone else will propagate them on. And that's why his legacy the legacy of the civil rights movement for Negroes. It will continue on forever until all minorities get their rights.
Brought to you by Brilliant.org.
Bari Science Lab to fall in love with math and science.